Hi everyone, my name is Ethan Perry. I'm a UX researcher, educator, and founder of the community Todo Se Diseña, which is a community for Spanish-speaking creatives and designers. And I am so excited to have partnered with Bravo Studio for this video, Introduction to Rapid Prototyping. So what are we going to talk about in this video? First and foremost, we're going to talk about what is rapid prototyping. We have to start somewhere. We're going to start with a basic definition and what it means to do rapid prototyping. Then we're going to talk about why is it important? Why should you be doing rapid prototyping in the first place? Then I'm going to briefly share with you when you should prototype. There's often discussion of should I just prototype at the beginning? Should I prototype right at the end when I'm about ready to launch? We'll talk about that. The fourth point that we will cover is what you should consider when doing prototyping. But not only what you should consider when you're doing prototyping, but also what you should consider when building any product or service. And then last, but certainly not least, after you have learned all of the theory, we'll talk about prototyping techniques and some tools that you can use when prototyping. All right, so let's start with the first topic, which is what is rapid prototyping? When you hear this phrase, rapid prototyping, what comes to mind, or what should you know about rapid prototyping? Before we mention what rapid prototyping is, I think it's even more important to just take a quick step back. What is prototyping? So, a prototype, simply put, is a tangible representation of an idea to spark conversations really with two groups of people. First, stakeholders, so those who are making the decisions, and second, the users. So you can have a great idea for a product, a service, a feature, but it can be hard to explain unless you make it tangible. So that's a prototype, a tangible representation, so that you can spark those conversations with both the people who will be using your product or service or those who are above you and making the decisions. Now, a prototype, as a researcher specifically, I always say that a prototype is one of the best research tools that you can use because it helps you test hypotheses quickly. You go in, you have some idea, some notion of what you're doing, but until you get it in front of the user, you have no idea. So a prototype can help you do quick research and validate, or not, your hypotheses. Now, when we're talking about prototyping, when we're talking about UX design, UI design, human-centered design, design thinking, all of these terms that are so popular nowadays, a prototype really is just a natural extension of the human-centered design process. It's not something that seems foreign or far off. It really is a part of the process, and it's just this natural fit. It's like another piece of the puzzle. And something that I am constantly telling myself is that you are not the user. So repeat after me. You are not the user, right? Countless times earlier on in my career, I maybe was on a particular project or designing a particular service. I said, hey, I would use this. And I started to think of all the ideas of everything that I would want to do and add to that particular product or service. But that was faulty thinking on my part. A prototype really is another way to make sure that you're not designing for yourself and your needs as the designer, but for the needs of the user. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about rapid prototyping. So the term rapid prototyping really originated and came from the manufacturing world. So rapid prototyping is this idea where it's a lot quicker than traditional prototyping, which could often take months or years. So in manufacturing, the ability to create a rapid prototype or a 3D model allowed companies to save a lot of time and a lot of money. When it comes to building digital products, it shouldn't take designers months or years to design or build out or create a prototype. It should be quick and agile. We know just how fast technology is advancing, and so we need to also stay quick. Let's now talk about why is rapid prototyping so important? Why should we even do it in the first place? Well, I'm going to share with you 3 main reasons. The first main reason is communicating design decisions better. Now, in comparison to, say, a static specification, a prototype is much easier to understand. And it's also much easier to get feedback on. If everyone can see how things might work with their own eyes, if they're actually able to use it and experience friction, it's a lot easier to get feedback than if you would just put a picture of the flow on a few screens on a PowerPoint. Really, a prototype is the best way to ensure that everyone shares a common understanding of how the upcoming product should look and behave. The second point is prototyping helps encourage new ideas. Rapid prototyping, if done correctly, really helps teams to experiment with multiple approaches and ideas. It facilitates discussion through the use of visuals. Presenting information in a visual format is the fastest way to get individuals to engage with the information. Whenever I'm prototyping and I'm heads down creating, a lot of great ideas come from that. And we implement those in, of course, always doing research, but I've had a lot of great ideas. And as we launch the prototype and get feedback on it, we get more ideas and we iterate on that. So one of the benefits really to rapid prototyping is getting new ideas. And the third point is reduce risk. Now, I'm sure there are a few products or services that might have gone to market without research, but the majority of them that don't do research end up failing and not being as successful. But if you create a prototype and test it with real users, and you figure out maybe that we missed the boat on some feature or functionality, and let's improve on that before you launch it to market, you're reducing risk. It's not just, okay, hey, let's hope that this product does well, launch it in the market and see what happens. I do not recommend that, right? So if we create prototypes and are constantly iterating in a rapid way, that can also help us reduce risk, invest months and months and months of work and millions of dollars in something that's not going to bear fruit. Now, with this the first point here, the communicating design decisions better, when I worked at one of the largest banks here in Spain, I was very fortunate to have design embedded very much so in the DNA of the company. And we presented bi-weekly to the stakeholders. And we decided to take a different approach to how we presented our information. Of course, we had the quotes, the insights that we gathered from our research, but we took it a step further. And several days before we presented, we had the meeting, we made a conscious effort to share the prototype with the stakeholders in that meeting so that they could use it, so that they could figure out and see what kind of problems we were trying to overcome. And then once we got to the meeting, they already had that background knowledge. They had already seen and ideally interacted with the prototype, and it just made the presentation of the results and findings even more valuable. So what I always like to say, especially when it comes to prototyping and the benefit of prototyping, especially when you're trying to share the benefit of prototyping with the C-suite or stakeholders, it's to show and not just tell. So first and foremost, before we start talking about when do we prototype, little caveat here, if you're liking this video so far and want to see more videos like it, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified when new content comes out. Okay, so let's talk about when do we prototype. Do we only prototype at the beginning? Do we prototype somewhere towards the middle after we've done our research? Do we prototype at the very, very end? Well, let me tell you. So I don't want to think of prototyping only at a specific point in the process, but rather prototyping, at least in my opinion, it truly is a mindset. And prototyping should be done throughout the entire design thinking process, throughout the entire UX process, not just at the very beginning. And prototyping can be done in different moments and in different ways, as you will see coming up here in just a second. So when I think of prototyping, I like to try to break it almost into kind of 3 mini phases, so to speak. So we first have the explore, where it's very exploratory. Then we have a refine kind of stage, and then a validation stage, right? So kind of trying to break down this a little bit more and looking at it in 3 main stages. So first and foremost, we see 2 lines here. The blue line indicates, the top line here is the amount of ideas, and the green line, or the line that is increasing, is fidelity of the prototypes. So as we move through, we start with a lot of ideas, and then we start to really focus on a few, and then fidelity, or the quality of the prototype, starts kind of low, but then gets better and better as we go through. So let's take a closer look at each of these stages. So the first part is when we're in an exploratory stage, we want to really ask a lot of questions. We're trying to explore, understand, and so the hypotheses are going to be really high level that we have at this point. When it comes to measuring, what we're going to look at is one question at a time, and our data that we're going to be collecting here is more qualitative. There are going to be a lot of different prototypes, and the quality or the fidelity of those prototypes isn't going to be very strong, right? It's not going to be well done, a lot of color, all of the text that we're going to use. So I'll share an example with you. Imagine we're creating an application to report accidents to your insurance company, your car insurance company, right? So in this exploratory stage, we may just want to validate the different types of icons that we'll be using and make sure that the users understand which icons, what they mean, right? Is this an accident? Is this theft, burglary, fire, etc.? And test out specific icons. Then, if we go to this middle kind of refined stage, the quality of the prototype is getting a little bit better, right? And we're really honing in on the specific ideas. And we're really focusing on the most promising options. We're not considering everything at this point. We've prioritized and are only focusing on measuring the options that received the best feedback from the user. And here, when it comes to, okay, we're going from maybe sketches, we'll talk about this later, but sketches or what have you, and maybe adding a little bit of color, adding a little bit of the content, and we're really focusing, what we really want to focus on here is the format and the experience. So actually going back to this, so to refine, so here if we're sticking with that example that I just shared with you, we don't quite have the application created where an individual, if they're in a car accident, for example, can upload their images and do their claims and everything from this app. We don't have that currently built. That's what we want to build. What we can use in this stage to, again, test the format and the experience is use something like any kind of chat platform, right? And you can simulate this experience. Sure, it's not a native app that you've created, that your company's created, but it creates the same kind of experience that you can test out and see if it works or what problems you might encounter. Then once we're here in the validation stage, where really we've started to work through, we've iterated maybe several times, and now what we really want to focus on is validating and testing particular features. We're not concerned, it's not very exploratory, we've already done our research there. But what we want to get is more detailed feedback, and this will more likely be more quantitative. And we want the quality of our prototype to be pretty top-notch. We want it to be ready to go to market and be ready to gather more feedback on. So when we're conducting, or better said, when we're creating a prototype, it's important to think about these 3 stages and to constantly iterate throughout the entire process. So when we are creating a prototype, what are some things that we need to consider? First and foremost, let's take a step back, actually. When we're creating a product or a service or even a business, we should consider these 3 things. Our business or product or service should be both desirable, feasible, and viable. And we should try to find that sweet spot that has all 3. So what I like to try to encourage people to do is when you're prototyping, also try to have these 3 elements present. Now, you may not know if it's feasible. You may not know 100% if it's viable. And that's perfectly fine, but try to aim for these 3. If you have a prototype that can touch on these 3 elements here, you're golden. That's perfect. It's not always going to happen, but again, that's ideal. So let me break down each one of these. First and foremost, desirability. When thinking about desirability, you need to ask yourselves the question, what's the unique value proposition? Do people actually want this product or service? And does it make sense for them? Feasibility is all about, does it work? Is it functionally possible in the foreseeable future? And then last but not least, viability is, can we build a sustainable business? And what has to be true for this business to work? What are the costs? How are you going to pay for it? So I'm a big fan of IDEO. If you don't know IDEO, I recommend you look them up. But even though you might have been getting feedback from people you're designing for, it may not quite be enough, right? And so IDEO in their design kit, which I've included the link on this slide, talks about live prototyping. And I love this idea of live prototyping. A live prototype gives you a chance to really stress test your complete solution in real world conditions. So you're not in kind of this bubble in your office testing it out, but you're really out there putting your solution to the pavement, really. And it can run from anywhere to a few weeks to a few months, but it's probably going to be the first time where you observe all the parts of your solution working together as one collective system. And if you hear this word pilot, it can be very similar, but usually live prototyping involves more real-time troubleshooting and iterations during a certain testing period. So live prototypes are really all about understanding the feasibility and the viability of your solution so that you can then optimize it further. So again, I encourage you to go to this link. I'll share with you the high-level steps of how to create a live prototype and kind of how to conduct it, right? As stated by IDEO. So the first step is you have to start somewhere. Determine what it is that you want to learn in your live prototype. What outstanding questions do you have about how your solution will reach its audience? What do you need to validate about its feasibility or its effectiveness? Once you've determined kind of your high objectives overview, you're ready to determine the scope. So how long do you need this live prototype to run in order to get the data that you need? And how many locations are you going to test? As a general rule of thumb, smaller is often better in a live prototype, as you will most certainly need to make changes and iterate your solution afterwards. Then the next step is all about identifying key indicators, metrics, and the tools needed to collect data. So IDEO also has another activity that I recommend you check out, which is monitor and evaluate. And that specific activity can help you identify key indicators and data collection tools that you will need. Consider the logistics of your live prototype as well. So again, maybe we're in a more remote context, but think about if you need a physical space, if you need additional hands, staff, uniforms, different permits, or anything else. Then this fourth point is run several at once. Left it kind of as a question there. If you have the capacity, think about running a few live prototypes at once. It's always great to collect more data and to be able to test a wide variety of options and solutions. And then last but certainly not least, and this is something that when we're talking about prototyping, I'm going to ingrain in all of you watching this video, keep iterating. If something goes wrong on day one, new approach on day two. Live prototypes are just about that, learning quickly, iterating on the fly, and pushing your solution closer to the real thing. And this is really going to, at the end of the day, fast track your progress in ways that you couldn't have even imagined possible. I want to share with you a specific example, again with IDEO, for a company called PillPack that was bought by Amazon. So for those of you who might not have heard of PillPack, it's a full-service online pharmacy that delivers your daily prescriptions in easy-to-use packages. So as you can see here, nice little labels, and it makes it really clear all the different types of medication that you might need to take in a specific day. So they came up with a live prototype, or what the CEO did was built a branded like lemonade stand kiosk in a mall and talked to potential customers. Online prototypes can have value, but this particular instance of live prototyping allowed the PillPack team to learn directly from prospective customers, have conversations, ask follow-up questions, and get real-time feedback about the business. So I encourage you to check that resource out. Live prototyping can be very beneficial and can even help you move faster and get a lot more insights than a traditional prototype. But later on, we're going to talk about all the different prototyping techniques and tools to do so. So now let's talk, now that you understand the methodology, let's now talk about prototyping techniques and tools. So I am a big fan of paper. First and foremost, before I even start thinking about a digital screen, I get out a pen or pencil, better a pencil, and just start sketching. Now, when we're talking about sketching, many people might think, oh, well, sketching is often done just at the very beginning when it's more of an ideation phase. And no, really what I love doing is sketching throughout the entire process, especially with those designs that are already robust and finalized and we've already tested. I like to still get out a pencil and sketch. Sketching is truly valuable. And I want to share with you a few tips when it comes to sketching. Usually, I recommend you start here before jumping directly into creating your screens. So the first tip that I have for you is to not get stuck on the first solution. As human beings, it's completely normal for us to, once we hear a problem, we want to jump in and we already have ideas running through our minds. So what's important here is to not get stuck and not only think about that first solution, because more often than not, it's a common solution that's maybe already been done. And so keep iterating, keep sketching, let your mind flow, but don't just go with the first solution. The second point is make sure you establish a clear purpose for each prototype. So don't just start sketching out screens if they're not of value or you don't understand why you're doing it in the first place. Sit down and before you even sketch, say, what flow do we want to test? What do we need to validate? And based on that, based on your answers to those questions, then start sketching. So you can say, well, we want to test this particular flow because of X, Y, and Z, and so I am designing the first 5 screens of that process, and that is why I'm creating this prototype. So always have a why. The third point is you don't have to be a Van Gogh, a Picasso, right? Sketching is really low fidelity, low quality. It's as simple as drawing shapes. And over time, you'll use tools, you'll add more elements to it, bring in other designers. The important part here is that you design it in such a simple, straightforward way that you can communicate what you're trying to communicate, and it's that tangible representation of your idea. So don't worry, it's not going to be hung up in some gallery. It just needs to be understood. And it's a lot easier than you may think. The next point is take photos of your sketches. Now, often a lot of us are doing things online whiteboarding tools, but still, I am just such a fan of old school drawing, writing, and taking photos of it, because oftentimes it could get lost in a million papers, and it's always a good idea to document it and have that design artifact. And the last point that I want to mention around sketching in general is make it a team sport. Have others join in and bounce ideas and critique one another. It shouldn't just be one person who's coming up with the ideas and sketching out the flows. Bring in other people and critique and question other people's designs. And that is where you're going to get a lot of valuable feedback and make some really great work. So of course we also have to think about digital. So I tend, from a process perspective, I usually start with sketches, something that's really low fidelity, shapes, black and white, no real content. But then once I want to take it to the next level, and especially am trying to show how complex interactions may work, then that's when I might create an actual digital prototype. So what are some tips that I share with you when creating digital prototypes? Well, the first tip is know your technical limitations. So now is not the time to go and learn the latest tool or start coding if you don't even know code. Just use what you have, your knowledge of what you have and the technical bandwidth that you have, and create a interactive prototype based on what you know. Now is not the time necessarily to go out and learn new tools that would take several months to learn. You can build interactive prototypes in PowerPoint or Keynote without even having to learn a whole nother software, right? The second point is super important. Avoid, at all costs, please, lorem ipsum. Use real data. When you start using real data early on, it's going to save you a lot of hassle down the road. Designs change, and so if you just use dummy text or text that isn't even relevant, not only are your users not going to get a lot of value out of the prototype, but also when you put in the real text, it may affect your design. You have to start from scratch and resize the buttons and resize the grid and align things differently because you didn't consider that at the beginning. So when possible, think about the real content, use real data, the real numbers, the real paragraphs, the real explanations, the buttons. What is this button going to say early on, because it's going to save you a lot of time. And the third point, which I constantly have to remind myself of, it's okay if not everything works. And just be upfront with the users when they are running usability tests. When you're running usability tests, that is a prototype. They may run into some bugs, and that's perfectly fine. Let them know that this is not a fully developed product or app. You're still working on it, and you're just wanting to test certain parts of it. Now, we've talked a bit in this video about methodology and the why, so now I'll talk about some of the tools. And what I want to kind of drive home here is a tool is just another means, right? If you don't understand the basics of prototyping, the tool isn't really going to matter. So hopefully you have been able to understand everything up until this point and understand why prototyping is so important. Now, I also caveat this because I'm a UX researcher. So I'm mostly in the research aspects of things, but I do dabble in design. So when it comes to actually designing interfaces specifically, these are kind of the three main contenders: Figma, Sketch, and Adobe XD. Really, with Figma and XD, in my personal opinion, pulling ahead. Now, when it comes to prototyping, you have Principle, in my opinion, replaces Sketch in terms of being able to do prototyping. But when we think of this, I mean, it's getting better, but I still feel. Here's design. We design a website, we design an app, design what have you. Here's development. I feel like there's still a gap here. I mean, it's getting better. These tools are getting better, but there's still this gap from something I designed to actually implementing the design. So why I like tools like Bravo Studio is that it allows you to turn your designs into native mobile apps without even having to write a line of code. And that's great. I mean, if you know code, even better. But you can take a design in Figma or an XD and make it into a real app, use real data, update it. And that's a lot more valuable when it comes to gathering feedback than just showing simple screens and kind of explaining or kind of making it into a Frankenstein where they can kind of interact with it but not 100%. It's a lot better to actually get it on their phone and have them test it out, give feedback. I want to share with you a resource to end this video and to end this particular section on techniques and tools. This is a great resource, uxtools.co. I encourage you to give it a look. You can sort by UI design, prototyping, whiteboarding, user flows, handoff. And it's a great resource, and you can specifically look at the different features, how much it costs, etc. Hopefully you found this video insightful. Please let us know in the comments below what has been the hardest part of prototyping for you. Or what other questions you have about prototyping, UX design in general, and we'll be sure to talk about it in a future video. Be bold, be Bravo.